All right, whenever you guys are ready, go for it.
Hey everyone, I'm Nick Bogacz, self-made small business success story. I went from working 5 jobs and over 90 hours a week to building a multi-million-dollar internationally known pizza enterprise. I never stopped. I won't fail. There's power in the pen, and today there's power in this mic. Welcome to the Business Equation Podcast. Today's guest is Jim Rooney, consultant, national speaker, and now an author. Jim is the son of Dan Rooney, legendary owner of the Steelers. Jim has worked alongside his father for decades, and his book is an intimate observation of his approaches Dan took that made him successful. Jim, thanks for being on.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely great. We got a nice day out there with the weather, and happy that you're here.
Haven't seen the sun in about a week or so it's nice to see it this morning.
Absolutely. So you've really been on the campaign trying to talk about the book you wrote, and I wrote a book last year, so I kind of know the feeling of being out there and promoting it. And this is the nice part. It was, I'm sure it was a journey for you to write the book.
Right. So we started the book we actually started the idea behind the book while my father was still alive. We wanted to talk about sort of the pathway to the Rooney role and what he had done throughout his life that sort of have created the credibility and the position where he could come up with the NFL's diversity requirements. So we're going to submit that to something like the Harvard Business Review. So we'd begun some of the discussions on that, and he passed away. So you sort of were at that point, do we continue to move forward or do we sort of pull the plug on this? And I had a couple interviews set up sort of right after his passing. And one of them was with Commissioner Paul Tagliabue, the former NFL commissioner. And we spent about, over time, I spent probably days with him, but I spent about 3 hours that afternoon with him. And, he really convinced me that a story like this was worth telling. And then it's evolved way beyond what we originally thought into a book.
That's fantastic. Was it a lot of behind the scenes? Was there a lot of mentorship from Commissioner Tagliabue too, of kind of telling you which way to go with it, or?
Well, I wouldn't say that he was suggesting which way to go, but he gave me some great insights into pieces of my father's story that I had always known existed, but giving you detail. If you write a book, as you did,
yep.
Everyone, I've talked to 50 different really solid interviews, but probably talked to 100 different people. And a lot of the interviews were, Dan Rooney's such a nice guy. Well, that's not a good story to tell. You need details. And Commissioner Tagliabue, among others, he really showed me where the records were. My father was the lead negotiator between labor and management. And so he was on the, on the stand in different trials since the early 70s, where my father would, when there were legal disputes between the labor and the NFL, my father would have been on the trial, and he sort of showed me where all these records were. So that gave me a lot of detail for this section. We talk about my father's work as the chief negotiator. So you got that type of detail. So rather than him sort of mentoring me, he gave me a pathway where a lot of detail to the story was. So
once you got this pathway and had an idea of how to go with the book, and especially like the legal part of it from the trials that he was on, was there always a sense like the book that you kind of wrote has the nice guy that you just mentioned, like that was kind of one of the keys to it, is you can be a nice guy and still be successful in business, right? Like,
absolutely. So I think that's the overriding theme of the book, is that you can be a good guy and win, or a good person and win. We have to say that these days, because now we have, I think we have 7 women who are at the ownership table at the National Football League. So that's a move forward, I think, for the National Football League. But you can be a good person and win, and then how do you do that? So we went into 4 main stories. We talk about, the Steelers in the 1970s and sort of what my father did to transform the Steelers from what were really the worst organization in sports. We were as bad as maybe some of the other teams we think of these days, to become, sort of the gold standard in the industry. My father's work in the National Football League, particularly around labor, and how he always had this win-win approach with folks in labor, that he felt like, you didn't, in a negotiation, you don't take everything off the table, that you leave a win for the other person, because down the road you're going to probably negotiate with them again. So he always had this win-win philosophy there. We talk about his time in Ireland, and you're talking about a major conflict there that bordered on a civil war, and how he was really did several things, but really worked to bring people together and to find pathways that didn't include violence. And then all three of those stories lead to the Rooney Rule and why he was sort of positioned as the guy with the type of credibility to stand up and say, we need to do things differently. We need to do a better job. And we talk about where that has worked and where there are still challenges on the diversity issue in the NFL. So those are the four stories of the book.
So I found the part about negotiating very interesting, leaving the win on the table. So was that something that he did throughout his career? Was that like one of, I think as a businessman, you find something that works for you and you perfect it. And I would think, like, is that one of the things that he perfected was how to negotiate? Was he an excellent negotiator?
Yeah, he was very good at negotiating, and I think you're hitting on some of the things that he evolved and developed how you do that. I think he fundamentally always understood that, leaving someone with nothing is not a good situation. It's not the right thing to do, and business-wise, it's not a good thing because, again, eventually you're gonna run into that person again. And he looked at the long game too. That's another part of the book. We talk about looking years down the road. But when it came to negotiating, he always tried to look for what was beyond sort of what the obvious point was. So he started talking about free agency in 1977 with a guy named Dick Anderson, who was the players rep from the Miami Dolphins, and he was the head of all the players reps back in 77. And they're looking at free agency. Free agency didn't come around football until 93, almost 20 years later. But my father understood, okay, this is something that's really important for the players. They want some ability, to maximize the market opportunity for them. So rather than getting caught where most of the other owners were on, we can never ever have free agency, he got into, okay, what is important to us? And it was competitive balance. So he looked at things like the franchise tag. He looked at some of these ways of how do you structure contracts? How do you build compensation so that at some point someone will have a chance to go, put their services on the open market with all, at that time, 28 teams. But also, how do you make sure that each team can remain competitive so that teams in Pittsburgh, teams in Cleveland, teams in Baltimore can compete with teams in Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, where you have these large markets. So that was a negotiating style of his that evolved, but he really, again, sort of looked beyond what was the obvious and built this understanding of maybe what was the core idea that you needed to have to negotiate effectively.
Would you say, too, that particular time, baseball was probably the number one sport, I would say. And then over time, baseball has never really done exactly what you said. They small market teams are, as we know in Pittsburgh, are boxed out. And, but the competitive balance, and now you see football is definitely a number one sport. Like, do you think that had a lot to do with it, being competitive and also making the players feel that they can go out and get their market share as well?
Right. So the 70s was the time where the world switched from baseball to football. We became the dominant sport in the mid 70s in terms of popularity, and television certainly had a lot to do with that. But you can look at this. There's sort of several complex issues around that. Baseball had been so successful in the ballparks for so many years that, in a way, they didn't want to respond to television strategically as well as we did because they wanted to make sure people were still coming to the stadiums, which is important in football, but it was more important to the traditional folks from baseball. So they didn't see the business opportunity as clearly as football did. So that was one piece. Then as you're talking about, there were sort of these three pillars. One was free agency, so that gave the players a chance. The other was revenue sharing, so that my father was very involved in revenue sharing, so that you had, when we got the television contracts, the Steelers and the Giants get the same money out of those contracts. And thank goodness that the Giants agreed to the arguments that my father and Vince Lombardi and these folks from the small markets were involved in, because had they not, you wouldn't have the Steelers of the 70s. You certainly wouldn't have the Steelers of the last 20 years that we've had the success. So you had revenue sharing where we all share the pot. And then you had a salary cap, which the players don't like, but that's really important for the fans because that, again, allows you have all the revenue, but then you still make more money in New York, in Philadelphia, in Chicago on luxury boxes, on club seats, on a whole host of other things, so that having that salary cap allows the fans to have players stay with their teams for a long time. And I think that's important again in Pittsburgh, in Cleveland, in these smaller markets that you see baseball. We get great players. They grow up here, they develop here, and then second, third contract, they're in New York or somewhere else. So
right.
So that those three pillars, the salary cap, the free agency, and the revenue sharing, I think really created the business difference of the NFL. It's interesting though, because I gave you sort of that dynamic shift from live audience to television. Now we're on the cusp of what's next and what's going to happen in streaming. And you see YouTube, you see all these dunks. The NBA has a lot of popularity. Now they haven't monetized it nearly as well as the NFL. Their business isn't as strong financially, but they have a tremendous appeal on YouTube. Clips from those games work really, really well, where I don't know that you're at that same point. And I don't know that any of us know what's going to happen in sort of the new digital platform world for all of the sports leagues. So it will be interesting to see if we, if we're able to be more innovative than baseball was 30 years ago, or if we get caught sort of staying invested in the old ways and not innovating enough.
That's actually a really good point. I guess that things change, and I think a lot of times, definitely from a fan perspective, you look at the NFL or the sports, and I don't know if we quite see the business side of it. You hear about the business side of it, but was there a point early on that your family realized that, yes, you want to create a product that gives pride to the city, but also that it is a business? Like, can you talk about how your dad kind of was able to balance both of those, giving, a great fan participation or, a fan sport, but also being able to realize that, hey, this is a business as well? Because even the stuff you're talking about with the labor negotiations and all this stuff, like, it is such a big business when you really think about how big the NFL is as a business.
Yeah, it's become a massive business, frankly, and it's different because I grew up around the Steelers as a family business. We used to, Christmas morning, we'd open our presents at 7, and if we were in the playoffs, which back in those days we were often, the playoffs were right after, and my sisters all worked in the ticket office. They would have to go down and work in the ticket office because we'd be selling tickets on Christmas Day. And the boys, we all had jobs in, we were ball boys and water boys, things like that. I always thought it was interesting that my grandfather was smart enough to put, the girls where the money was and the boys were picking up socks and jocks. So, but that, that family business approach was great fun, and we learned all about it. It's different now. It's much larger, as you said. I think what my father did, he just had that fantastic ability, and some of it was intuition, but a lot of it, I think, was strategic and developed, where you treat people with respect, you appreciate that everyone involved. You have to understand that there's a dignity with every single person that you work with, and that was fundamental to him. And these weren't compartmentalized, and I think that was where he found that balance. The things weren't compartmentalized. Mel Blount, who he had one of our great defensive backs, he had really tough contract negotiations with. But Mel always talks about, my father was the first one who helped him build the Mel Blount youth homes, so that you have that ability to integrate these things rather than compartmentalize, rather than them being separated. And I think that's the fundamental magic, if you will, I hate to use that word, of his approach, that it was about achieving that balance of, you have certain standards, you have to have competence, you've got to be able to do the job, whether it's on the field, you got to have some speed, strength, ability to tackle, whatever, but also that relational side. And that these weren't, we're going to work on relationships on Fridays and on team building days, but the rest of the time it's only bottom line. That all of that stuff has to constantly be balanced, and that everyone talks about culture. My father understood that culture was dynamic, that it was never static, that you don't get a culture and then it's done, that every day you're working on that cultural piece. And I think that was fundamentally what he saw, which was, again, you got to tend to the relationships. You got to tend to the people and their needs, their wants, their emotions to a certain degree, but you got to set the highest standards possible. But if you do both well, that it actually becomes, rather than sort of this separated dynamic, it becomes one where if you're happy at your workplace, you want to work more, you're more interested. If you have to work till 10 o'clock on a Friday night, yeah, it's a bummer, but you know that this is something you're really committed to. So that was the environment he created, and I think that was how he helped build the NFL and helped build the Steelers in a way where they were able to respond to the market conditions that just kept growing and growing and growing. People inside the organization wanted to be there, and then we kept expanding our fan base because it's not only that people left Pittsburgh. We have the second largest Spanish-speaking fan base in the National Football League. So, those folks weren't necessarily in Pittsburgh, but it was this idea that people resonate somehow with the Steelers. So, to your question, I know this is a long way off.
No,
here.
you're good.
To your question is that he understood the market was growing. He understood the dynamics of the market. He understood that you needed competence, that you needed the highest level of standards, but that the best path to get there was longer, slower, and having this dedication to the people who were going to help you get there.
I talk a lot about on the show that you have to care about your people before they care about you.
Yep.
And it sounds like he definitely lived that.
Yep.
And you could see that when he did pass, there were so many players that came out, and you'd see on TV like the stories they had and how much they genuinely cared for him. And I thought it was interesting that there must have been just not like negotiating, but it seemed like he actually had relationships with a lot of the players too. Was there always like an open door policy where they could talk to him if they needed to talk to him? And it seemed like he enjoyed being around the team too. Is there a lot of truth to that as well?
So absolutely. So my father's relationships with the players, but really I think everyone in the organization. I mean, that was the other thing that he tried to do was as much as possible. And look, in all organizations, you have roles, you have different positions, you have different focus on important decisions and decision makers making those decisions. But for the most part, he really tried to create stability, not only sort of consistency, so that you had people understood what the job was and what the ask was, but stability where at least from him, I think he really tried to treat everyone the same. And sometimes that bothered a few guys because they had some big egos, and you frankly probably want a few guys with big egos. You just don't want insane egos, but you don't want church choir boys all the time playing football for you. You need a few guys that have a bigger personality. So at times it didn't always work, but across the board and over again, the long run, I think he tried to treat everyone the same way, where he said good morning to everyone in the office, whether they worked in the equipment room or they were a star player. So I think that environment helped a lot from the standpoint that you hear people talk about the Steelers being a family, but we really were a family, and that wasn't always that. Like all families, it wasn't always fun.
Sure.
You know what I mean? People felt upset that they didn't get more attention every once in a while, but they understood that they were almost being treated the same way they would at home. That if they weren't meeting the standard, it was clear to them that they had to meet that standard. But that the person, as I said, sort of cleaning the lockers was just as important as the guy in the locker. And my grandfather really set that tone and was great at that. But that was something my father carried out, and again was able to do that while having those very high business standards.
And you talked a lot about breaking down the different subjects of the book. Can you talk about we talked about the labor negotiations and that part of it. So leading up to the next part, which would be like the Rooney Rule, can you talk about how that came about?
Sure. So I think philosophically, it was something that was important to my grandfather. So my grandfather, Art Rooney, who started the Steelers, he promoted the first open heavyweight championship between two African Americans here in Pittsburgh Jersey Joe Wolcott and Ezra Charles. I believe it was 1955. It was right after Joe Louis gave up the championship belt. So this was an issue. Diversity and fairness and giving people an opportunity was an issue that was important to my father, my grandfather, and my father. In 1968, my father hired, I believe it was the third African-American scout, a gentleman named Bill Nunn. And Bill helped bring us access to the historically black colleges and universities, the HBCUs. So from 1969, I hope these numbers are right. They're in the book, so read the book. But off the top of my head, I believe it's 69 to 76. The Steelers drafted more players from the HBCUs than any other team. And Bill also helped create this environment that my father and Chuck Noll really believed in, which was, look, everyone should be treated fairly. And no one should be treated overly fairly either. But it really gave guys, John Stallworth, Donnie Shell, who's up for the Hall of Fame, who we're all rooting for, it really gave them a chance to say, look, if I go to the Steelers, I'm going to get a legitimate shot at playing. If I'm the best player, I'm going to get a legitimate shot at playing. And that was the atmosphere that was created through my father, through Chuck Noll, through Bill Nunn. And what Bill had shown my father is that you can expand the talent pool. You can go to more diverse places. And not only is that sort of this good thing to do, we feel the altruism of it, and I think that's a good thing, but he demonstrated that no, if you find people that aren't getting an opportunity and you give them an opportunity and they're good enough, they will outpace everyone else, and that's what these guys did. I mean, you look at that team in the 70s, not just the superstars, the Hall of Famers, but so many of the guys were playing those filler roles, the special teams, Sam Davis, Ernie Holmes, so many of these guys who were coming from these different experiences were the rank and file contributors as well to those Super Bowl championship teams. And they were, as I said, not only given an opportunity, which was this good thing, but they were outpacing their competition. So you had that experience that my father had that was so crucial to his life in football. The Steelers of the 70s, I think, proved to all of us that, okay, the Steelers way, this approach can work. And then probably too many years later, Tony Dungy, who was part of the Steelers of the 1970s, gets fired by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And there is a big study done by a woman named Janice Madden out of University of Pennsylvania, and it proves that black coaches are getting fired more quickly than white coaches, meaning that they might have more successful records, but that they're relieved from their jobs earlier than a white coach who might have had the same record. And so I think that study, my father had been involved in I think several good initiatives, but they weren't enough before that. And that really was sort of this tipping point where Commissioner Tagliabue again said, we have to do something, and it can't just be sort of a PR stunt. So my father led this committee. They brought folks in from industry who had been dealing with and are still dealing with these same challenges. I mean, look, this challenge isn't solved in the NFL, and it's not solved anywhere else in business. There's still some very challenging systematic problems to diversity in decision-making jobs. It just doesn't happen enough in America. But what the Rooney Rule really took into account is, okay, one of the problems is that within the hiring process, you're not bringing enough people to the table. And he learned this from, again, some industry experts. So the idea of creating a diverse slate, which is basically what the Rooney Rule refers to, a diverse slate of candidates, became sort of the preferred method. So my father helped bring the consensus of bringing that about, and then he became the champion. He was on the phone, for the next 15 years of his life with every team, GM, whoever it might be, to try and promote opportunities. He understood who the candidates were and, where and when opportunities might come up. And he was, he wasn't advocating that you hire a specific coach, but he very much was an advocate that this process be taken on with sincerity and integrity, that you have a legitimate interview, that you're not doing these perfunctory interviews on these folks, but that there's a legitimate interview in the process. So he spent the next 15 years of his life. I think we've also learned since then that the idea of getting to a more diverse having the more diverse candidate likely getting the job, you should increase it from more than one. And there's other challenges involved, and the NFL has done some things to improve it, but I think if my father were here, he would say we still have to do more, and corporate America still has to do more. I mean, this is the NFL, because we're a leader in sort of the public space. We get a lot of legitimate criticism for this, and rightly so. But if you look at tech, if you look at finance, if you look at manufacturing from a decision-making standpoint, you have these same challenges.
And I think what's interesting with the NFL too is you have seen it definitely with the Rooney Rule. You see that there's been a lot of progress made. Because even when you mentioned Tony Dungy, I remember as a kid, like Art Shell was in and out as a Raiders coach.
Yep.
And that was really, really quick. And then I think, how important was it leading up to when Bill Cowher left, bringing in the new coach? How important was it that basically you guys did exactly what you were talking about, that you walked the walk at that point?
Well, right, and we did walk the walk, but it wasn't, and Mike and my father would be the first to admit this, it wasn't important that Mike be black. It was important that they followed the process. So the Steelers, when Bill decided to retire, we looked at 37 candidates. I don't think most people, go to that extent. So there were 37 initial candidates. We came down to 12. They interviewed 12, and then they had 4. And Mike was really the outlier. First of all, Ron Rivera, who just took the job at the Washington Redskins, was our Rooney Rule hire. So Ron, sort of checked that box of interviewing a minority candidate, and did a fine job from what I was not in the interviews, but from what I understood in the interviews. But Mike was this young guy who everyone was saying was probably a year or two behind. But my father just kept being intrigued in every conversation he had with him. He just loved his energy. He loved his approach. He talked to Tony Dungy, talked to another gentleman named John Wooten, who's been a chief advocate for these. And they said exactly that. They said, look, he's young, but you hired a young Chuck Nolan, you hired a young Bill Cowher, and they may have had to learn a little bit on the job, but they really ended up being fantastic, so that they followed the process that was consistent with the good hiring practices of my father, which is sort of, if you want to say what is one technical thing, well, we talked about negotiating, that was pretty good, but one technical thing that Dan Rooney contributed to, and its hiring processes, 3 coaches in 50 years was him. He was a main decision maker in all 3 of the National Football League commissioners over the last 60 years. He was involved in labor, the labor disputes. So he understood hiring, and he always thought that if you want good talent, you have to take your time. You can't worry about the media. You can't worry about your sense of urgency that, I'm not going to get this project done. You want to bring someone that fits in your culture, fits in your organization, is going to contribute for a long, long time.
So I think that's really interesting, because I think that's where a lot of people in small business, they get stuck, because they talk about it's so hard to hire. It doesn't matter what industry you're in nowadays. And I think what you're saying is, take your time, get the right person. But can you also talk about how important it is to keep that person? Like, I think retention is so important. And 3 coaches in 50 years, that's probably the gold standard for retention right there.
Right. It absolutely is a challenge. And again, the best way to retain someone is to hire someone good up front, because then you're not trying to get rid of them. So you've taken 50% of the equation off the table if you get the right person coming in. The second side is, if you've done that well, I think you have, throughout the hiring process, you have really tried to do a good job of expressing your values, your approach. They know if they're going to fit. And sometimes we think we're going to fit and we don't, and that happens. But I think for the most part, you create that environment. And then the third piece that my father did, and Joe Gordon, who was our great PR guy during the 1970s, Joe would be considered, chief communications officer these days, or chief marketing officer, a little bit of both. But Joe was just fantastic, along with Chuck Noll and Bill Nunn. Joe is sort of the third part of my father's management team, that if you ask me, are you surprised when we go to California that we fill a stadium full of Steeler fans, or Arizona, we get 60%? Joe Gordon played such a key role in that. And Joe talked about my father as an orchestra conductor, and that, he didn't tell you as the trumpet player, this is exactly what note to play when. but he had a close enough ear to what you were doing that if you were off, he would address you directly. But that he let everyone play their own notes, but he always brought them into concert together, and that's how my father worked. He was constantly in meetings with folks, but it wasn't micromanaging. It was, are you aligned with the vision? Is what you're trying to do, taking us in the direction we want to go in? And so it was coaching, it was give and take. Joe Gordon is the guy that saved the terrible towel. My father didn't love the terrible towel, and Myron Cope obviously invented the terrible towel, but after its second year, he kind of was fading. And Joe said, look, this could be a really great thing for the Steelers. We should keep some interest in this. And my father said, oh, it's a gimmick. Let's not get too into a gimmick. But it's that type of environment where an employee can have an insight, and in that case, obviously a pretty important insight,
Sure.
and be able to push back on their boss and say, I think this is really important, and the boss is willing to listen and change their mind and respect that someone else might have a perspective. So I think that is the type of environment when you talk about retention. People always want to develop themselves, they want to excel, but they want their own voice. They want some autonomy. They want to be, I hope, in concert with the rest of their team, but they also want to be able to make a contribution themselves that is significant and meaningful. And I think my father created that environment, and that I think speaks to retention and people wanting to be involved as much as possible. You look at Tony Dungy as a coach, or some of these other great coaches, sometimes there's just an opportunity that comes up that's so good that someone is going to move from an assistant to a head coach, and you don't have a head coaching position open, and you wish them the best. So you're not always going to retain your best talent just because there's only so many decision-making jobs within an organization. But I think if you create the environment where folks really feel that sense of that their contribution is valued and has an impact, I think you can keep people, at least that's what I saw my father do, keep people around a long, long time.
Yeah, I think that was great insight to how that works on a big business scale. But it's so important that you listen to the people who work for you. And I think the terrible towel is an excellent example. Can you imagine the Steelers without a terrible towel?
Right. Can you imagine Pittsburgh without a terrible towel?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And I actually was at the game in San Diego this year. Right. And where we took over the stadium. Yep. And it was amazing of how many Steeler sombreros and big Mexican rugs, like over top of the fans out there. I mean, it was just it was unbelievable. You talk about the Spanish influence, like the whole section I was in was Spanish. It was just unbelievable. I was like, I never knew there were so many Steeler fans that were, and then that were from that side of the country. And then when they found out I was from Pittsburgh, it was like a celebrity out there. Right. We had such a great. That was probably one of my favorite games I ever watched. And I was actually out there on business. I was by myself, and I said, "Oh, what's the chances the Steelers play tonight?" And then I hopped on I literally went from the stadium, Uber to the hotel, picked up my bag, and right to the airplane, or right to the airport. But I thought it was that experience at the stadium was just unbelievable. But there was such a presence out there that was just amazing.
Yeah, and I think that it is. People resonate with the approach that my father took, that when we're at our best, that idea that everyone's dignity is taken into account, but we also manage that with the highest standards of competency and execution. And look, obviously we were 8-8 this year, so we didn't achieve everything we wanted, but I think people believe that we're able to combine those two things well, and that was what my father did, and that's what I try to write about in the book. And we intend to, we haven't finalized it yet, but we intend to come out with a Spanish version of the book. I don't know how big your Spanish-speaking audience is, but later this year, because we know that audience enjoys the Steelers so much.
Yeah, they really do. There was no doubt about it that was so unique for me to be there and see it. I was like, this is unbelievable. It was just it was an awesome game. It really was.
Everywhere I've ever been, I remember us in Chile in South America. I'm actually closer to the South Pole than I've ever been to the North Pole. And I'm on this beach, and it's this volcanic beach, so it's black sand. It's really a unique place. And I see someone walking down in Chile in South America with a black jersey with a 3 and a 2 on it and gold sleeves. And I'm just like, anywhere you go, you run into Steeler fans. So that was a special experience. And you see the terrible towels at the space station, on the Great Wall of China, and in Africa, wherever it is, there's Steeler fans.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess was there that part of it, like that you see Steeler fans everywhere, and at some point, the Steelers became this thing that's, I would say, as large as the city. I mean, it's just really like, when you think of Pittsburgh, you definitely think the Steelers. Anywhere I go, people definitely say, "Where are you from?" You say Pittsburgh. Oh, Steelers. Doesn't matter where you are in the world, like you're saying. Did that help the next step of the fourth part of your book, when you talk about your dad's relationship with Ireland? Like, I'm sure it was always close to his heart, but was it also like when he got asked to be the ambassador? Can you talk about how that was and how important it was that he had already developed himself and he already had a sense of who he was and how that worked into the next step of his career, I guess you could say?
Well, it's interesting because my father started his involvement in Ireland in the 70s. If you look at the things he did in the 1970s, they're at least from my standpoint, pretty amazing. There were 3 major lawsuits. We won 4 Super Bowl championships, and then he started this organization that became the #1 cultural support for peace, culture, and charity in Ireland, called the American Ireland Fund, all before he turned 45 years old. So that's a pretty impressive resume from my standpoint. But so he had done these things back in the 70s. You had this violence, and he really saw it playing out in. It wasn't so much this religious Catholic versus Protestant fight as the context we put around it, but it was discrimination in housing, discrimination. Catholics weren't able to get good housing, they weren't able to get good education, and they weren't able to get good jobs. And so you had violence. I mean, you had people shooting at each other and blowing up bombs. And I remember the town of Derry in Northern Ireland being there when I was a child, and it looked like a World War II movie set. There were just piles of rocks on the ground. There were no real stores or hotels. You were in what looked like a war zone, and you had, people that looked like, the Irish kids in Boston or Philadelphia or anywhere else, and it's just like, wow, this is a very real conflict. And he went and as I said, started to contribute to trying to find ways to create alternatives to violence. And it was through integrated education. It was through integrated workforce development. So he'd done that for 30, 40 years of his life, and really got the American business community to commit to investing in this. And then he worked with a lot of big businesses. He helped bring Dell Computers has a big footprint in Ireland. He helped bring that to Ireland. So he worked to sort of help change the economy of Ireland, but it was always designed to help bring an alternative, an opportunity for peace, an alternative to this violence. So then he becomes ambassador, which was interesting in a way because we had known that he was one of the potential people to become ambassador, my brother Art, the Steelers president, and I. And we were thinking, oh, this would be good. Maybe he'll take a retirement job. Well, my father was never going to retire. So he went over there, and everyone in Embassy Dublin talks about they loved it because these guys, they committed their lives like you do at the Steelers to foreign service. And they said, he came in Ireland, a lot of guys would go there and just golf, ambassadors, and he came in and he increased the project load by 3 times. But they all said they loved the idea that the ambassador was really engaged. He did these things. He had these interfaith luncheons, so you had a massive growth in the Muslim population in Ireland in those years between the 70s and 2010. He did a bunch of things for the Chamber of Commerce to help build the business relationships. And then the one really fun project he did was, so on the 4th of July at every embassy, you have a baseball game. Well, my father didn't want to have a baseball game, so he created basically the Super Bowl of touch football in Ireland. So you'd have the Marines, my son, who was a high school football player at the time, they would play on this field, and he would invite all of the embassies and all of the diplomats throughout Ireland would come to this event. It was this big event. He had jumbotrons put up. You had all this really cool stuff. None of it at taxpayer expense. We found corporate support for all of this stuff. so this was this wonderful day that everyone really enjoyed. But what was really cool is, at the 50-yard line of Three River State or at Heinz Field, you have the Steelers symbol. At the 50-yard line here, you had the CO of the United States of America. And it was just, the Marines were just so proud to play on that field. It was just this really cool thing to have what was amounted to be a touch football game, but to build it up the way he did. So that was one of the fun projects he did. But everyone loved that, and everyone in the whole diplomatic community in Ireland thought it was it was a lot of fun to be part of.
I think that's an interesting answer because it's not like he got to be famous and was like, okay, I'm from Ireland, I want to be the ambassador. It really was his heart of giving back for all those years and almost like a life's mission that kind of led him to the finale of being able to do that at the end.
Yeah.
Was it always important, not so much for your dad, but I guess for your family, that as you become more successful, that you give back? Like, it seems like that's a big part of it too. When you think of your family, like I would imagine that was always something that was there. Was that something that you kind of just grew up with, that was just a sense of giving back? That
Yes. So the Rooneys came from Ireland in 1845. I won't go all the way back, but like so many families as immigrants, I mean, they suffered for years. The two grandfathers beyond my grandfather, I guess it's great, both lost their jobs in steel mills in Western Pennsylvania. My great grandfather, I know it was almost a decade that he was out of work and was searching for things to do, and that was the environment that my grandfather grew up in, and he had 10 brothers and sisters, and sort of creating opportunities to make it were so important, so that when we had some level of success, it was always made very, very clear, you have an obligation. This is your responsibility. This is what you're to do, is to try and give back. My father certainly did that. My mother, I think, is very, very dedicated to a lot of important causes. So I hope I've done that with my life. I've certainly tried to. But yeah, I don't want to sound sanctimonious or whatever, but that was made clear. Like, look, you've been very, very blessed. This isn't an option. This is your responsibility.
I just think it's important from the sense that, in business or small business, as you get successful, or even on the whole journey to being successful, that you realize that you're put in a position that's different from other people, and that you're in a position where you can give back. And I think, we've tried to do that in our business, whether it was when we had one store or now 5 locations. Like, as we get bigger, we give more back. But it's always like, it's just important. I think that you got to care about the community that you're in, almost like talking about how you care about the people before they care about you. You got to care about the community before they care about you too. Because I think there's times when communities look at businesses and they wonder, are they just here just to make money, or when they see like, hey, they're really here to give back and really be a part of the pillar of the community. I think it's important. I think that's one of the things that makes the Steelers a really unique story, is they're a big pillar of the community. And I think all the things that you talked about today really give more insight of how that has really happened. And it does go back to, from my perspective, just listening to you talk, it does go back to being a nice guy. Like, it seems like there's a lot of sense of, and you get a lot of that being from Pittsburgh. People say, boy, you're really nice.
Right.
Like, a lot of people get that just from being in Pittsburgh. And I guess maybe there's some of that sense of hard work and blue collar, and then just being a nice guy. But it's great to hear this story from that perspective, that just somebody with good fundamentals of just like a human interest story, that just somebody that was able to be nice to people and get such a great reward. And what an interesting story, and really the life of your dad. Just, it seems like it's just a great story when you think about it, like how nice somebody was the whole entire. Like, I guess what I'm trying to say is, not everybody.
I hope everyone thinks it's a good story and goes and reads the book.
Yeah, they should read the book. I think it's just interesting because a lot of times you hear about business and it's cutthroat and it's tough. And, what I've tried to do in my business is just be like a nice guy. And as you get bigger, it's harder because you have to, have relationship with, as you get so many employees, it's like, well, how do you communicate with, the guy who may only be here a month, or maybe you're only going to be here for a year, and you don't really see him as much. But it's like those simple things of saying hello in the morning to everybody and, shaking their hands and introducing yourself. And it just seems like he always lived that kind of life, I guess.
Yeah. So I think one paradox of my father's life, which I try to explain in the book, is sort of the idea that, he really wasn't interested in power. He wasn't interested in money. He wasn't interested in recognition, but he had a lot of influence. And he felt that there was an accountability to that influence, that he had a responsibility to do something for others, whether it was his organization, which he understood had to make profits, or whether it was the community or in all of those, the people involved. And he didn't focus on, again, the power, the money, or the recognition, but he ended up getting a ton of those because that wasn't his focus. His focus was on trying to do the right thing when it was community or people related, trying to be effective when it was business related, making sure that those things, matched, that they weren't inconsistent with each other, that you could do both together. And in the end, he, the guy had, a fair amount of recognition. He had, I don't know that power was ever the right word, but he certainly could influence things for the good, and he tried to do that. And it, he was as well known as any sports owner there is. And again, it was by not focusing on it that he kind of got those things. It was on focusing on the job at hand and the people in front of him.
And doing the right thing. I think that's kind of what I was trying to say before, that's exactly it. And you said it was, he just seemed like he always just did the right thing.
Yeah. You talked about being nice, and I think he was nice, but he was more good than nice. It was about doing things that were good. I do think people from Pittsburgh are amazingly kind. I like you probably, get to travel a lot. And, there's good people everywhere. And I don't ever want to say it like that. But Pittsburgh has this amazing combination, my father talked about this, of kindness and toughness. And I think that's sort of what he was. He represented Pittsburgh because that's what people are here. They're very, very tough, but they're very, very kind. And how they bring that together so well is sort of amazing. If, when we live here, we kind of take it for granted. But when you go around the world, you see like, oh, that's a pretty uncommon thing. And it's nice that it's common here.
I definitely agree with that. I think it is interesting as you go in to other places, you have that sense of, you're right, you're kind, but also there is a toughness that, hey, if you got to be a certain way, you have to be a certain way, I guess.
Yeah.
Because who knows what kind of situations come up.
Right.
So
I'm not going to say I'm the toughest guy in the world. I just make sure I always have some Pittsburghers at my back wherever I go.
Right. So I think the experience of writing a book, I know for me, was definitely a journey. Can you talk about like the journey you found yourself going back and digging through old things to bring them to light, and the process of, just writing the book? Like, what did it mean to you to write a book about your dad's journey? Like, I would think that had to be very special.
Well, so one of the cool parts was all the interviews I did, and I interviewed a woman whose husband, John Hume, won the Nobel Peace Prize in Ireland. So John has Alzheimer's and can't speak, so I talked to his wife, Patricia. And, she's in tears with me talking about how Bill Clinton had visited Derry in Northern Ireland, Tip O'Neill, President Bush. These folks had all gone to this place, but she said, your father and mother came every year, and they came into our community and they spent time with us. And she said, look, I appreciate that the big dudes came because that was important to make the big changes. But the fact that these people, your parents, came every year and were consistent and spent time with us, and our children love seeing them. My father always bring them Steeler t-shirts. That idea, this sort of common humanity that we talk about, this Pittsburgh way of doing things, really had an impact. And she's in tears telling me these stories. And that was particularly dramatic, but over and over I had this experience where, whether it was Joe Green or Patricia Hume or, someone on the side of labor, where they would pause and there would be this emotional experience that we had in the interview. And it just meant a lot to get to do that. Writing, working with editors and writers was a great learning experience. It's like a puzzle piece. There's at one point I think we had like 700 words, and the book is I think 700 pages, and the book is 238 pages. So cutting things down and making them work, and then this whole publicity part. Really getting in a conversation with folks like yourself, the large television audiences, bookstores where only 10 people show up in an hour. All of those people having this conversation about for me about my father and carrying it forward has it's really been special, and I've enjoyed it. Everyone asks what I've learned. I don't know. I mean, I hope I've learned a lot, but it's been more of the impact and the experience of this man touched people's lives, and his way of doing things is something that's important to people. Again, that you can win and treat people, you can win and be a good person. I think most people want that in the world, or a lot of people want that in the world, and it's nice to kind of have been connected with people who want to see that, hear that, and talk about that.
And you think he would have liked the book?
My father was pretty tough on his kids. So in the end, he would have liked it, but he would have given me a hard time about a lot of things. First of all, he would have said, you shouldn't be out there, you're just tooting your own horn. So he wouldn't have liked that side, because he did his own book, but he got talked into that by the folks at the History Center, and he didn't like doing his own book. So he would be giving me a hard time on that. But I think that he... I think in the end he would like that those 4 main stories. I think he would think those were the 4 big stories. He would have loved the interviews and the idea that all those cool people were involved. Joe Green and Commissioner Tagliabue, as I said, so many of these people from Ireland. The folks from the labor world, the business world. He would have liked to have re-engaged with them, because he loved the conversations he had with them. So after he gave me a hard time, I think he would have enjoyed it.
That's great. And Joe Green wrote the foreword, right?
Joe Green wrote the foreword, yeah. Really special experience, and the things he said. He talked about my father helping him grow up and grow into a man. It's a really special thing to hear from Joe Green.
Sure. That's fantastic. Can you talk about where we can find the book, and where they can find you and get some more information? And
absolutely. So we're sort of trying to be everywhere. Amazon is our #1 partner, so you can go to Amazon and get the book. And in Amazon, you can get it in all 3 formats right now: hardcover, paperback, as well as a Kindle edition. We're working on the Audible edition, so it will be out in audio soon. The Steelers shop, Steelers.com. And then Giant Eagle. We've had a great partnership with Giant Eagle. So those are 3 places where folks can go. I also have a relationship with Barnes & Noble, so we're doing a couple book signings. We're going to be in Monroeville. I don't know when this is airing, but on January 11th, we're going to be at the Monroeville Barnes & Noble, and then we're touring the country this spring and going to be at a whole host of places where, Florida, Arizona, California, places where there's a lot of Steeler fans. We're going to try and spend some time there.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much for being part of it, and thanks for the insights, and great luck, and best of luck with your book.
Thank you so much. It was really great to be here today. Really enjoyed the conversation. And thanks to all the guys that put this together.
Yeah. Absolutely. This has been The Business Equation. I'm Nick Bogacz. Give thanks, be humble, be grateful.
Nice.
Thank you.
Good thing.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
That was great.
Nice.